Hi, you guys. This is Richard Sachs. We're back on Lost Arts Radio. This is our Sunday show with inspiring and educational guests that we find from the best places all over the world. And tonight we have a fun show with our friend David DuByne, who has been doing a lot of work on the global temperature patterns and everything that's connected to that, what's coming up in the near future, the years ahead, ice age cycles and global heating and cooling and things like that. It should be super interesting. He's the author of a book called Climate Revolution with a couple of co-authors, Bill and Richard Porter, if I'm not mistaken. And it's called The Climate Revolution, the Grand Solar Minimum, How the Sun Will Affect Society, Economy, and Food Prices. And he's a creator of a website called oilseedcrops.org, and we'll find out why that name came up and how it's connected to the whole subject. And this is something that I've been interested in for quite a while. I was studying these kind of temperature patterns and gas ratios in the atmosphere and things when I was a university student in the 60s, and with the authors of a book called The Survival of Civilization, which maybe David has heard of. We'll get his take on it. John Hamaker and Don Weaver. That was pretty interesting. And at that time in the mid 60s, we thought that it was definitely going to be another ice age soon. I mean, not before we finished school, but pretty soon. And that we were connecting that to a lot of different things, including mineral content in the earth and how it could be reversed by worldwide application of rock dust. Some interesting, quite outside the box ideas. And lately, being involved with Lost Arts Radio since I became more visible with Doug, I've been talking to a lot of people on both sides of the climate prediction argument or discussion, that it's really about to get horribly warm, as many people are saying. Both sincere people and not sincere people are saying the same thing about that. And not as many on the side that are predicting global cooling. So it's really going to be educational for me, and I hope all of us, to hear as much as David can share with us. I've seen one credible presentation recently from a scientist, it seems like a real scientist, that was giving a talk in Washington State when they were trying to decide on some state policies recently. We'll talk about that. But there's two subjects that are often talked about together, which is the global temperature predictions and trends and geoengineering, which I think is way too respectful of a term, but it's often used to try to convince the fake scientists that somehow it's important to stop, which, if they haven't figured it out after decades of having the information available, I don't think it's super likely that they're right about to, come out with telling the truth. They like their positions and they're just saying what they're told to say. But these two subjects are often talked about together, and we'll talk about why that is and why it matters to decide on the temperature pattern changes for stopping geoengineering, because that's something I don't get. And anyway, welcome, David. Sorry for the long introduction, but I'm really happy and excited that you're here.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. We had an incredible conversation when we spoke before.
Yeah.
And again, the whole geoengineering thing is about claiming responsibility for cooling the planet on a natural cycle. So, Harvard comes out with their public geoengineering program now, talking about spraying calcium carbonate in the atmosphere. If it does go ahead and if there's any cooling, they're going to take credit for it. And then they're going to implement a global tax and say, well, if we ever stop spraying, because we're the ones who cooled the planet, if we ever stop spraying, now it's an in perpetuity, entire global tax that you can never stop paying.
Well, do you want to say something about your background, going back as far as necessary to show why you care about this stuff and what got you involved in it? And then people will take that as the background when you start telling us what you came to.
Yeah, so when you go back, I was 100% CO2 warming believer myself in reasons for the atmosphere changing. I had seen the Al Gore movies, hung out, in organic farms and everybody talking about the same things. It's warming, it's CO2. But then I was a coffee buyer down in Myanmar, and the farmers down there started talking about cold damage to the crops that were down there, literally the coffee plants. And the smaller ones, when they put out in the field after they've been raised in the nursery for 1 year, they were getting significant losses from cold to the point where they were overplanting. I would say 12 to 14% was the average. So just a simple question, well, it's getting cold. I was told it's getting warm. And they said, oh, no, our great grandparents also talked about it. It got cold back then too, and they just overplanted. And then a couple decades later, it came back to the same, and then it's been the same, since the 1910s, 1920s. And it's been, for them, stable down in Myanmar at that point. We're talking about 12 to 14 degrees north latitude, somewhere in that range. So for me to say cold weather damage on the coffee plants, the bean density being affected, the top leaf cover being killed off by frost that they would have to trim off every year, and then the small new plantings being killed, that made no sense to me whatsoever, being that close to the equator. And then I started to look in for reasons why. Because if you're in a business, you're also looking for supply, and can we expand the supply, and how much could we really get from the farmers to expand their production on their land out there for us? So it was originally just for me doing a forecast, just for business, 5 years out, how much more can we increase the supply? That simple, really, in a nutshell. And it led me down this path I never expected to be led down before. And I thought, wow, this is so important. If it is a repeating cycle, it's going to affect everything on our planet, our society, our economies, and just the way we perceive reality. And I am hoping that the changes in the sun will also morph and help us understand the reality around us and the control systems that have been put in place on top of us over these last several centuries.
And just to be clear about where you're talking about, because most of the U.S. population's not super expert in geography, Myanmar, if I remember right, used to be Madagascar. Is that right? And it
used to be called Burma.
Oh, Burma. Okay.
Burma, yeah, that was the old name. When the English were in control in the 1800s, well, all the way, through the early 1900s as well, it was called Burma. But now it's called Myanmar. So once they got their independence, they renamed it. That was the original name of the country, was Myanmar. And then the British returned to Burma.
That was your territory for coffee business there at that time, right?
Yeah, and also northwest Thailand, up in the Doi Chang area. And we were looking around in Laos as well, a little bit further up there. But again, it was north and western Laos. So that whole area right up there is the coffee zone. It's like the golden, I wouldn't say golden triangle in terms of what we know it as the connotation, but that's the hot zone for being able to put coffee. It's the right altitude at about 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters, up to 1,200 meters. Arabica beans. It was like that whole area is the coffee central of Southeast Asia, if you will. Vietnam is it's a really low growing bean. It grows down a couple hundred meters, 1,000 feet in elevation. It's really bitter. It's a different kind of bean called Robusta, but this was something totally different. It's more of a higher altitude bean. So being in altitude is different than being closer to sea level, but still, this cold damage made no sense to me.
That's a warm area even at that altitude, huh?
Really warm, yeah.
Okay, so what happened after that?
Well, since I was searching for answers, I started to look about what the coffee farmers had told us about their grandparents in the 1880s, 1890s experiencing cold. So that was my first stop. And then instantly I ran into John Casey's information. He was a former NASA space advisor. He was a lead investigator for this space shuttle. Remember when the explosion, this space shuttle exploded in the sky and it fell back to Earth? He was a lead investigator for that for NASA. So his reputation was very solid. And he was saying that these cycles come around every 400 years. I did a little more research. I watched a bunch of his presentations, and then the light bulb went off, and I said, well, you know what? I'm going to contact this guy. And this was before a lot of notoriety or even what a term grand solar minimum or grand minima was. So back then he was a little more accessible. And then he gave me a whole bunch of breadcrumbs to follow down. He's like, go check out this report, look at this place. And then he gave me a whole list of PDF search engines and different kind of report like Spring Linker and all these different types of places that you can find reports that are published peer-reviewed journals that the public never really looks for. But if you're looking for that kind of information, going to a PDF search engine and putting in specific keyword data can lead you into all this climatic data, this paleoclimatic data. And then we start looking back at longer cycles, because the whole thing about the climate debate's all wrapped up in the space age or the last 150 years, which you can't see any longer term cycles inside that really small frame of time. But if you start going further back in time, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 12,000, how about a whole ice age? How about the last interglacial? Then you can start to see longer term patterns inside the cycles that move on our planet here, from the 100,000-year cycle to the 25,000-year Great Year cycle to the galactic cross at the 12,500-year cycle. And then it keeps shrinking down, but it's very similar to when you open the back of a Swiss watch. You have some of the larger dials in there that are moving around some of the smaller dials that in turn, mesh with medium-sized dials. It's very much like a Swiss watch, thinking about the cycles and how they return, because nothing's linear. It's all cyclical.
Okay, and this was when you were at that point. What year was that about? How long ago are you talking about?
2012 and 13. I didn't start the YouTube channel until 2014, after I was very solid with the information. So I'd done at least a year of solid, informational research before I thought there was really a point that I could explain, and I had to understand it enough myself to be able to explain it. And then I started looking for these unusual weather events that were not supposed to happen because of global warming. And the case in point that I would really like to drive home is Al Gore told us we would never know what snow was again. Our children would not know what snow was. We would need virtual reality headsets to understand a snowstorm. And then we get the biggest blizzards ever in 2014-15, biggest snows across Boston ever recorded back to the 1700s. And, instantly it was like the BS monitor was like, whoa, I'm going to start focusing on this and challenge what was given out in the global warming debate narrative from, the inconvenient truth, and a little further back, say circa 1999 forward. It's always been the same regurgitated talking points, and nobody wants to debate it. If you try to debate a true CO2 narrative person, they never want to take the debate, because they know after they go 2 steps into the debate, well, there's nothing else to talk about except bring it back to CO2. And when you have solid data with thousands of peer-reviewed research papers going, no, there's longer cycles and we're starting to repeat one, their narrative falls apart so quickly. And it's very difficult, and I will speak from experience, to get somebody who is highly on the CO2 bandwagon to come over and debate, because they don't want the debate, because it derails the narrative once the true science comes out. And this is herein lies, because in the introduction there, you were saying, people that are proponents of heating because of CO2, people who are proponents of cooling because of cycles in the sun, they don't really meet in the middle. They're afraid to debate. And I will happily sit down with somebody face to face live like this and debate on the CO2 narratives. Well, as long as we'd have access to, a search engine so we could pull up graphs and charts and things.
Yeah.
I can prove my point.
One of the things that makes it really hard to have that kind of discussion is that almost instantly it usually turns into showing who's a bad person. And it's the goal is who's right and wrong, not what is right and wrong. And I've seen that so many times, not just with this issue, but with a lot of others. It's like, if that could be dropped, if we could remember what science is, which is like, I don't care if my point of view is shown wrong, that's valuable data. It just means I correct myself and learn more. That's just basic, simple science, right? And it's rarely done anymore. It's like, you have to fight to prove that your team is right. And it has nothing to do with finding out what's true on any side. I mean, if you can relate to that.
I can, because for those of you, I'll give you a nugget of info here to follow yourself. If you go back into the late 1990s and you type in the term NASA, 3,000-year high in solar activity, you'll understand that through the 1990s and all this, supposed warming based on mankind, we went through a 3,000-year high in solar activity. And generally in history on the backside, it drops literally straight down off of a cliff. So following even that simple pattern, and knowing that the heating was a natural cycle in a 3,000-year iteration of that, generally what follows is something also in the 3,000 to 4,000-year cooling pattern immediately after that. So you get these giant spikes in heat, and that's exactly what we saw. So when you start to talk about this, and there is some truth even in the warming bit of it, the CO2, not so much for the cause of everything. There is some, I will admit, some input from CO2 into the whole mechanism of global climate change, but it's nowhere near 100%. I would put it somewhere around 5%, maybe.
You mentioned Al Gore. One of the things I remember that he warned everybody about, so that we'd be prepared, is that there would be no more ice in the North Pole, the Arctic area after, I think it was 2013, and that's all the land animals, the ice animals, would die at that point. So that hasn't exactly happened the same way, right?
I would say not. For those of you who are fans of polar bears, in 1970, pop quiz. In 1970, how many polar bears were there in the Arctic Circle? Now, keep in mind, the Russians never did a polar bear census. If they did, they never made it public. So everything you know about polar bears is only half of the Arctic Circle. It only includes the Canadian, Alaskan areas and parts of going a little bit over toward Greenland. That's it. The Russians never did it, or I'm sure they did, but it's just not public. So everything you thought about polar bears, A, is only half of the Arctic Circle, but B, in the 1970s, the polar bear population was hunted with this harp seals, etc. How many polar bears were there in 1970?
5, and they all died.
Yeah, there were 5,000. There were 5,000. Last year, this is a Canadian Ice Service government. Canadian Ice Service polar bear census. How many polar bears were there 2016 and 17?
I don't know.
25,000. Now they're becoming such a nuisance that they're overpopulating and they're coming into habitation zones. So you start to read stories about they had to close the schools, they had to close down the town, they bring in professional hunters because they even canceled school, not because of a snow day, but because literally of a polar bear day where there was polar bears wandering through the streets where the school students couldn't go to school because they were terrified that the children would get eaten by polar bears trying to get to school. And I am not joking. I promise you, look this up. Anything I say tonight, and let me before I even step another inch further here, anything I say tonight, I do not want you to believe. I don't want you to believe it. I want you to do your own research on it. I want you to try to disprove it, and then you come up with your own mind. Do your own thinking. Don't rely on me to think for you. Try to disprove me of everything I say tonight, and then do your own research.
Okay, and it's not a bad idea with that in mind for you to mention at the end some good sources for that research too, from what you've seen, and why you think they're reliable, or maybe. That's another thing that I think stops a lot of people, is that most of these government agencies or anybody connected with corporations or supranational organizations that have their own agendas, they've been shown to be giving information that's false all the time. So trying to pick ones that you feel like are really reliable is at least some kind of a challenge, right? And you must have dealt with that issue and come to some conclusion on how you do that.
You know, I ran into that in the beginning, and one of the first things I did was I went back to the Climate Gate email release. Now, the Climate Gate was all about a number of scientists, which you would all know by name, conspiring to lower the temperatures in the past to make it appear as if it was a linear trend in warming. So then what I would do is jump through there and look for the institutions they were associated with, different data sets that they drew from, because I, in my best knowledge, thought those would be the ones that were the tinkered with or manipulated the most.
Okay.
Now, the Danish Meteorological Institute, I think, is still one of the pure ones. It's outside of U.S. influence, and they're the ones who monitor the ice up in the Arctic, and it never went anywhere remotely close to Al Gore's no ice in the Arctic. And then Peter Wadham's also said the exact same thing. And the list is lengthy of all these people claiming and calling, no ice left, no ice left. We only have 5 years. We only have 10 years. Oh, wait, what's happening again right now? Like, how many failed predictions can continue to drum on without us asking these questions? Media never asks. Now we have 12 years left to live. Well, what happened back in 2000 when we only had 9 years? What happened in 2009 when we only had 5 years? And it just keeps going on, and they just keep pushing the goalposts back.
Yeah, some are saying 7 at this point, I think.
Okay, what? Throw your favorite number in there, you know?
Yeah, they all agree it's between 7 and 12, though. That's pretty much, the science is settled on all that.
Totally settled. Don't even ask another question. Go back to work and pay your global carbon tax. It's all good.
Yeah. Now, you also talk a lot about the connection between the sun and temperature trends and patterns on the Earth. Why would I mean, people understand that the sun, when there's no clouds or chemtrails in the way, the sun actually makes you warmer. But I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're talking about what they refer to as solar activity. What is solar activity? And then once that's thoroughly understood, why would that be connected to anything here?
See, the basic science in the schools is not really taught, because if you were to ask this same question in 1950, every student would know exactly what you meant. But now when we iterate over here, 2020, most people are shaking their heads going, solar activity, what's that? No, you know, there's a huge disconnect between the education system and what was originally 1940s, 50s, 60s, and somewhat into the 70s, you know. But when we come into the 90s, 2000s, and now, there's a complete disconnect to remove this type of, or, you know, not really teach this type of basic information that used to be taught in the schools. I mean, what's a sunspot? You go out on the street and you ask people what a sunspot is, and I'm telling you, more than half won't know what it is. And that
most of them don't know anything about what's going on in the world right now. It's not that education is less effective. It's completely successful. It just has a different purpose at this point. And it's really working well, as far as I can see.
Yeah, it's almost turned into indoctrination versus it has the education. Because I don't know, I'm going to ask you the same thing. We're kind of looking at the same world. Do you feel it's more of a narrative now that is being pushed through the schooling system, where they have 12 years to drum in the narrative of think this way, behave this way, versus actually giving real fact? And, you know, now students can give themselves a score. Oh, what?
Yeah, right. No, it could be hurtful to get a grade from a teacher, you know. But they do know they're probably the wrong gender, and that's because of white males making them think that. But as far as other subjects that used to be considered important, even a couple hundred years ago, when students were much more literate than now, they haven't heard of most of that stuff. There have been man on the street interviews, some of which were done by women, which were great, asking basic questions about history and who's in office in the U.S. or other countries right now, and, you know, just basic ideas about government. And they couldn't find anybody that knew the answers to any of them. And this is at university campuses.
Yeah, I've seen a few of those interviews. They shock me sometimes too. Like, what year was the country founded? And they're like, I don't know, 1982. And there's a real serious answer.
They asked when the American Revolution was, when America got its supposed independence. And many of them thought it was about 1970 or so. So education's working well. It's just doing something different.
So, you know, that steps right into the sun information here, which I'll come back to, and I'll give you an answer on that. But it seems that they're trying to remove any kind of nationalist thought to, again, global citizen, global tax. I think they're trying to do away with any notion that you're a citizen of a country, and there's this whole new world passport, you know, movement in the last couple of years. And you're a global citizen now, so why would you not support a global tax to stop a global problem with the global CO2? Would you not?
And don't use energy.
Yeah, and this whole thing about smart cities, where then they're going to try to, you know, you don't live on the land either. How dare you cut a tree, you know, and you can't even do any of your own farming because you're going to disturb the soil. I mean, those weeds that are in the way there, you can't cut them down for animal feed. You're using a tractor to do that, or even if you use a scythe or something. Right. You know, that's made in a factory. That metal has been forged somewhere. You use CO2 polluter. And it's trying to get on the centralized system of control to push everybody in cities. Then they're going to really regulate how much electricity you can use. Right now in California, I don't know if you saw these new laws in California. Next year, they're going to mandate, I think it's 55 gallons per person per day on the water usage, which means you can't take a shower and you cannot wash your laundry both in the same day.
I saw that, and it's scheduled.
Is that right?
That's true, and it's scheduled to get less every year after that. The amount of water you can use.
Yeah, to what point is less? Sponge baths? I don't think so.
I don't know. There's too many people, you know. So we'll see.
Well, the current way we have set up, or the society has been set up. I had a great talk with somebody earlier about wireless power and Nikola Tesla earlier, and the amount of businesses that would not be needed in terms of mining, manufacturing. We talked about electric cars that were developed in 1880. So you go back to let's go back to the late 1800s. Electric cars were invented then.
Yeah.
So imagine free wireless power to power your electric car that would require no fossil fuels.
Right. Yeah, because
electricity would be free. We'd need no lines. We'd need no mining. We need no coal industry. We need no very little rail. It would have shaped our world entirely different, using the wireless power that's around us in this plasma sphere, if you will.
Well, was it in the 1990s or a little bit after that? It was demonstrated that a car ran all this. You can't say this, by the way. This is really crazy to say if you want to stay on the air, but I keep doing this. I can't help it. That it's already been demonstrated that cars run on pure water, even impure water, even dirty water. A couple gallons, and that's all you need to drive all over the country. And that was demonstrated in the U.S. in a dune buggy, I think, before the inventor was killed, by agents who were supposedly buying his patents so he could become rich. And so, solar is archaic. There are things that are far, far better. And they're just suppressed. It's not an engineering issue.
Richard, you okay? Do you need your medication? You're talking wild thoughts there.
I've got all the bottles here, so if I have to...
You do? Okay, yeah. Double your dose today. You're talking too wild suddenly.
I know. Sorry about that. I'll try to be normal.
Now, couple in that wireless power, wireless electricity, and then imagine anti-gravitics, which was really, really expounded on in the 1960s with Dr. Brown, and the possibility of making things more weightless. So right now, these cars, they're trundling down the road at 3-4 tons? Mm-hmm. But imagine on each wheel, if there was an electrogravitics device that could make the car more weightless, not make it zero per se, but reduce the amount of literal weight that's down there. Because when magnets are pushing off of each other, they have a resistance force. And then they also found when they had opposite rotation discs, once they reached around 1200 RPMs in different directions with their copper galling on it, they started to raise off themselves. And I'm really questioning how far this technology has been brought forward since the 1960s. A lot of the military aircraft and applications, especially these ones that are flying around like Mach 17 now, that's definitely using some of that tech to cut through the plasma edge on that thing to blast through what is considered air weight. So why would we not be able to do it also with weight on a car or weight on a train?
Well, you know about the work of Stephen Greer, right? Dr. Greer?
Yeah, a little bit.
He interviewed hundreds of people who were willing to die to talk freely about this stuff, about what they'd actually done, not just heard from somebody who heard it from somebody. They were actually involved in the programs. And you can't say any of this too, so we'll make sure, and everybody agreed not to tell anybody about this, okay? But what they call gravity control was mastered in the early 50s, and that was no more need for fuel at all, and weightlessness achieved anytime. So what they've got now is fake flying saucers, and you definitely can't talk about this at all. We'll make sure not to tell anybody else, but the idea, Werner von Braun warned about this before he was dying, when he was dying, to some close friends, and he said they're preparing for the ultimate false flag, which is an alien invasion, fake alien invasion, using UFOs that are manufactured and use gravity control for flight, silent and no fuel required, and they can go in any direction, make right angle turns and all that. And he said that the reason they want that as their ultimate false flag is, you were talking about anti-nationalism. It's just like in the movie Independence Day, where you obviously have to give up your sovereignty in order to fight the evil aliens. And all aliens are evil by definition. And the government will stage that. So hasn't happened yet, but he said that it was ready to go. And as far as the wireless electricity goes, my only concern about that is that at that time they weren't worried about RF radiation or anything like that. And it would have to be checked to make sure that there's not a side effect to have these massive currents actually flowing through the atmosphere. But they have little boxes now that'll power your home with no fuel. So I think we're beyond it. Just a problem with advertising.
Yeah, and the manufacturing too.
Right.
I know up in Korea, they were working with the magnetic motors up there too. They had taken the Parandev motor and then a couple steps further. And in Korea, they'd done a couple public demonstrations where it was outrageous on the beach with all these halogen lights, and then they suddenly just disappeared, and nobody's heard from them in over a year. It's just interesting how that happened. They come up with a working model,
right,
public about it, went out to showcase it, run around, show all this, how this tech works, how everything spins inside. Suddenly they're gone. Who knows what happened to them? No more invention, not talked about anymore. So if you find those videos, please download them, because they might very well disappear. That's nothing conspiratorial. It's just this kind of tech leads to freedom of humanity, and without the control devices upon us. I mean, what's this whole thing with the saber rattling in Iran going on now? I mean, none of this would be possible. None of it should be taking place at all. If we would have free power, we wouldn't even be having ever a conversation, or we never would have been the first skirmish in the Middle East had we gone an entirely different direction away from centralized fossil fuel control. This is the best way to put it.
Well, and you were moving up to the point where you would talk about what is solar activity, and then after that, why that has any effect on us millions of miles away.
Yeah, so think about it right now. This is a perfect time to talk about it, because have you seen in the news feeds over the last couple of years, we've come into something called the solar minimum.
Yeah, but explain what that even means.
Yeah, what does it mean? So generally the sun oscillates or moves in, it's a little more powerful, has a little more sunspot, a little more activity in these higher periods, and then it comes into these low periods like we have now with no sunspots. So think about sunspots as the indicator on how much energy is coming off of the sun. Now, we're told it's an internally powered star. That's great, but it wouldn't explain the oscillation or the changes from higher activity on 11 years to lower solar activity on 11 years with no sunspots, break for a year and a half, then it goes right back into higher solar activity and then back down again.
So what's a sunspot before you go too much further? If somebody has no idea what you mean when you say, is that a dark spot on the sun or what?
Yeah, it would be. It's about the magnetic polarities a little different at that point. So at the top there in the granules, when you're looking at that, that's a magnetic disturbance in the top of the sun, if you will. Because if you really zoom in on satellites, and I would suggest that you go to the Solar Dynamics Observatory, otherwise known as SDO, and you can get an enormous amount of images of the sun every day, and they go through the magnetic fields, and they go through the sunspot, and they show you different color wavelengths if you're interested in that. But they also dig down right onto the very surface, which I love watching that surface of the sun bubble. It's almost a little granules in constant motion up there. But when there's a magnetic anomaly, they start to break, and you'll start to see those darker spots form. That's a magnetic. That totally has to do with magnetics on the sun. And, you know, we were told that it's an internally combusting star. So when you see these dark spots on the sun, I always wonder, why is it not brighter down underneath that thing? Why is it darker underneath there when we get these magnetic anomalies, otherwise known as sunspots? There's far more sunspots in a very, very active sun. So as the sun spins, like our Earth spins in the exact same speed. So our north and south poles match exactly, and we're always, because it's a hard crust. Up on the sun, it's a little different. The northern and southern hemispheres are spinning at slightly different speeds. This causes the snaps and the breaks and the changes in the magnetic fields. Because imagine if the north is, you know, 1 day faster than the south. So after one whole month, it's 30 days faster than the south. So it's moved enough around where the magnetic field lines, if they were connected, would have been bent and shaped and twisted enough where they're snap back and try to recreate a new magnetic field on itself. And this is where a lot of these sunspots form, is when, you know, like again, the magnetic field on that particular area on the sun is having, let's say, a not smooth day. That's the reason it's there, is the best way to describe it. And now you have to think about the 11-year cycle. So we got these sunspots. There's a lot of when the sun is in high solar activity. There's very few of them. Like right now, we had 281 days in 2019 with 0 sunspots. That takes us back to 1913. So you have to go back to 1913 to find 281 days in a calendar year when there were no sunspots. So again, that's a cycle on 100 years in itself, and they call it the centennial minimum, like centennial, like talking about hundreds of years or centuries. Bicentennial, like, 200 years. Because I grew up when it was 1976, we had the bicentennial from American founding from 1776. So some of these same words can be interchanged from regular day usage, like bicentennial or centennial, into what we talk about governments and century marks. But this is the interesting thing. For those of you who like numerology, 36 cycles of this 11-year smaller cycle equal this 1 grand solar minimum. It's a much longer
11-year cycles. You said 36 11-year cycles.
Correct, on the average. Now, sometimes it's 37 11-year cycles, depending, because not every cycle is exactly 11.5 years. Some of them are a little bit longer, some of them are a little bit shorter, but when it comes out for the average is, interestingly enough, 36 11-year cycles, which is a sliver under 400 years.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Have you seen the pictures of the sun's surface that have ripples, like it's almost a liquid?
Yeah.
How does that fit into the gaseous model?
See, again, are we truly taught the true nature of our universe? Because if it's a plasma universe and there's a current inflow into the star, and that's what makes it glow, that explains the sunspots, and that explains the electrical frequency on a model of 11 years, 400 years, 2,000 years. What takes us into ice ages and out of ice ages? Sure, than CO2. So something electrically is happening up there that caused changes. And when you look at the sunspot cycles, and then you look further out in time, it really looks like an electrical wave. Like you're looking at somebody's EKG heartbeat, electrical. Yeah. This is where the wireless power from Tesla comes from.
If you didn't know any better, you'd think that things are alive beyond what we're told.
Yeah, and think about the energy field that pervades everything between us. It's not dark matter, dark space. It is a full-on living electrical field up there of consciousness and electromagnetism. So, talking about Tesla's free power, that ether field is what they were drawing on, and that's what pretty much pervades the universe. Now, when you have currents in it, think about, an electric line up that you see in the sky hanging from 2 poles. In space, there's also those conduits between stars, between solar systems. Right. They're called Birkeland currents, and this is where you're going to find a lot more activity. And when you look out at the further, larger star field, you start to see strings of pearls. And this is galaxy formation, and they always seem to be along like a straight line or some kind of, they seem to be more formed. They call it string of pearls, just like a necklace. They're on dot, 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 dot. They're forming also in that Birkeland current where the electrical formation's allowing different matter to coalesce. It takes electricity to do that, electromagnetism. So again, when you look further out, it's scalable. You can take it large, you can bring it small, whatever you like. So when you come down to the atom, we're thinking something. What holds that thing together? Isn't CO2. You know what I mean?
Probably not, no.
It can go infinitely
it's a smaller scale solar system, basically, right?
It is, yeah.
The speeds are a bit different. So, okay, so
you can make it move faster and change state if you put electricity into it, and if you put it in a different field magnetically or electrically, you can get that to change state as well. So think about it at the larger scale, in the larger cosmos, if you will. If you change the phase state of that, you're going to change stars, how much they glow brighter or how dim they get. It's the same principle.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the old saying that if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Because that's how you deal with everything, is by hitting it with a hammer. If you have a certain type of knowledge, what we call science, different versions of that, then you interpret the universe in those terms, and you don't see what else is happening. So, but whatever activity is going on the sun, what's the mechanism other than just, it's the same size sun and heat's still coming out of it? Is it, people would say, well, is there less heat coming out of the sun, so there's an ice age, or more heat, or it's something more subtle than that?
Well, the ice ages are in debate on how they start and how they're ended. Some people, sometimes they're talking about how our planet is pulled a little bit further out on its orbit over, thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000 years. So the conjecture of going in or what exits us out of it, really an unknown on that. But a way to measure it scientifically, something called total solar irradiance, TSI. And the way you would know this measurement on how many watts per meter squared strikes the surface of our planet is through solar panels. They measure this because how many watts per meter squared you're getting on your solar panel is going to depend on what your output is. So if you have a 400 watt solar panel, you're going to need a certain amount of square meters to equal that 400 watts, depending on how many watts are striking that surface. Now, scientifically, you can measure that at rises and falls. And what's causing that change from the literal output of the sun, the light frequency and the UV coming out of the sun changes. So if it was internally combusting, it should not do that. What's causing those changes that are measurable through science of how much light is striking the surface of our planet? Now, our scientific instruments, the best ones we have only been around since the 1970s in the space age, but they leave little traces across history here with these isotopes. So when things change, matter changes, it leaves remnants, if you will. So these beryllium-10 is a good one, and oxygen-18, like these show either rainfall or they show cosmic rays. So if you're going to look for, we didn't have when they started looking for cosmic rays was about the late 1800s when they were experimenting with X-rays, and they started to see these little zips across their sheets.
Cloud chambers, right?
Yeah, cloud chambers too, right around that time. So we know pretty much from the late 1800s approximately how many cosmic rays there have been. But if we didn't have the instrumentation, those things also leave a trace, an isotope called beryllium-10. That's very measurable in laboratories. So you can go back in history, and if you're going to search for any kind of documentation, look for beryllium-10, cosmic rays, 10,000 years in the last 10,000 years. And you'll get a whole set of data that comes out where people study this stuff, and they just dig down and they measure either the ice or the rock or the wood that they found in a cataclysm. Like they say, for example, they knew this place was buried in 800 BC during a volcanic eruption. They can dig up those trees, and then that's their start point. So if they find a 300-year-old tree that was buried in the volcanic eruption at 800 BC, they can just, they can see how fast the trees were growing through the tree rings, but then they can also take part of that and then test it and see the beryllium content in that as well. So there's like a million ways that you can measure this stuff, going far back in time versus what we have with scientific instruments. So a unified sun that burns at a constant rate should have none of these fluctuations and changes. And when we look back through history, we see up 2 degrees Celsius, down 3 degrees Celsius, up a degree Celsius, down a degree Celsius, up 2, down 2. Nothing's constant on this planet. And with a constantly burning, combusting star, we should have an even range of temperature, which should never vary. But it does. And what causes all that change? Well, it has to be something to do with the output of energy from the star, which loops us back to that total solar irradiance again.
Right.
What causes that? It's electrical.
Okay, so you're correlating the amount of solar energy reaching the surface of the Earth with the cycles of ice ages, basically, in some way, right?
On the longer 100,000 year cycles. But again, nobody really knows what's the cause of the ice age that's going to snap us into that. But these cosmic rays and the amount of energy coming to our Earth, obviously the amount of energy coming to our Earth for 90,000 years out of 100 or out of 10,000 years that we have right now, this warm period, is very different for those 90,000 years when we're plunged into ice. What is changed on our sun at that point? And within this warm period, there's also changes in how much of that sunlight or heat or energy from the sun is striking our planet. So you got to think about that. Go back, you hit it on the head, the longer period cycle, 100,000 years between the ice ages. So there's obviously a huge, massive disconnect on the amount of energy arriving at our planet versus where there is now, where we're not buried under 2 miles of ice in Chicago.
Right, but what would happen if humans went crazy or had some malicious motive, and they devised a way to artificially cut about a quarter of the energy reaching the Earth's surface in the terms of the sunlight. Would that have some kind of effect?
Yeah, that would be devastating. Your temperatures would drop significantly.
So,
that would be an ice age right there, pretty much.
It's that looks like what's happening now, because the measurements I've heard of from the people who seem to keep track of this is that about 23% of the sunlight reaching the Earth's surface is now blocked in the last few years. And it's going to be interesting to see what that does. I mean, it's going to be combined with the effects of everything else. So it's hard to, when you have infinite variables, it's hard to do a lab experiment, right? But that's one of the variables that is pretty clearly in effect right now. And I know where I am in Arizona, it's famous for having 300 clear days a year. And it still does. It's just you can't see them because they're on the other side of the spray residues.
Nasty.
And so most days are no longer clear below the spray levels. Above that, they still are. There are very few natural clouds, but most of the people don't look up more than about 10 degrees. And so they don't notice anything unusual going on. Pretty big climatic effect, though.
Yeah, and think about that. When we're coming into ice ages, and even if the sun steps down or the amount of available sunlight was to decrease, it's not going to be an instantaneous thing because the oceans are still holding so much heat. They're heat sinks. So just because the sunlight stops for a second or gets diminished,
there's a delay.
The oceans are going to have to catch up with that. And when the oceans dissipate their heat, that's when we get into it. So you brought up an important point here with the geoengineering. There has to be some equilibrium. So if the actual surface temperatures were being affected by the stratospheric aerosol geoengineering programs, then the heat from the oceans would probably try to rise out to equal that or match it. So maybe, that could be one of the reasons that we're seeing spotty heat across the planet, is something is trying to equalize. So this heat sink of the oceans, when that's all out, or when it reduces in its temperature, then I'll bet we'll see some significant drops. But right now the oceans are real hot comparatively, because again, we've had 2,000 years of time to heat pretty much consistently. The only breaks there have been is these grand solar minimums for 20 years or so. And then it's game on, 300 years plus of solid heating again into the ocean. And then, you get that 20-year respite where it cools down for a little bit. And we're only talking about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. But that's enough to devastate plant production and the seasons where you plant. And when you harvest, that's thrown completely out the window at a 3 degree Celsius drop. 20 years of that doesn't affect the ocean too much. And then you're right back in again, heat it up.
So the oceans are a demonstration of what they used to call passive solar system, right? Where you have this giant heat sink, and any temporary temperature changes in the air get modified. It's like living close to the ocean. You don't have the temperature extremes in your climate if you're in the middle of a continent. And the same delay effect is after the solstice in the winter, and the sun starts getting longer every day, which it is now in the northern hemisphere. You still get it getting colder for a while. There's a drag, a delay, right? Because the effect of the warming of the minute every few days of extra sunlight takes a while to show up. So you're saying it could be happening that way now on a global scale, right?
My personal opinion is yes. Now you can agree or disagree, but the lag time, and again, the media tries to paint it as it's an instantaneous thing. It's not. So a lot of time these comments that I get on my videos after I do them or the podcast, it's all about, well, it only takes 8 minutes for the sunlight to go from the sun to strike the planet. We should be seeing these changes you're talking about in 8 minutes. This is the kind of either specific manipulation in that as people trolling the boards, or maybe people just believe that within one season it should have changed into this extreme environment after a single season. It just doesn't work that way.
Because of the passive solar effect with the heat sink of the oceans and stuff like that?
Yeah, and this is routinely. Let me give you an example of a heat sink that changes on a 60-year cycle. The Atlantic Ocean in the northern part. They called it the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation. It's called the AMO for short. And any of you look this up, it's a 60-year cycle. And when it comes to the bottom, and when that gets a little bit cooler in the Atlantic, you see global temperatures reflect that as well. So there's a direct reflection of Atlantic temperatures and global temperatures on the land. So guess what? We're heading back into the 30-year cold phase of the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation on its 60-year phase. The sun is stepping down into a grand solar minimum. Both of these are happening concurrently. So it's going to be an interesting time over this next 5 years. Is really, I believe that don't delude yourself out there if you're listening, because it's warm in your area this year. This is a direct reflection of the equatorial vortex breaking its pattern and pulling heat up from the equator to where you are, mid-latitude US. It's 70 degrees in December. It was 70 degrees, no, it was 50 degrees in Norway a couple days after Christmas, because an extratropical storm out of the Atlantic dragged a bunch of warm air up there. So if I'm saying that, this thing's not happening because it's warm in my place and I'm in Milwaukee and it's warm this year, I'm like, you're right in the center of the changes. That's why it's warm.
One of the big changes is these new wind patterns. Instead of a standard trade wind, like in the U.S. going from west to east and carrying the storms in that direction, now they have these things, not only new kinds of clouds they haven't seen before, but things like polar vortices, which will pull the cold air away from the North Pole down into the southern U.S. and allow warmer air to go where the cold air should be, things like that. What do you think's going on with that?
And I'll take it on the inverse too. So let's say that polar vortices goes down to Cuba. Well, right behind it, there's a huge gap for something to pull from the equator straight up there, going all the way up to Alaska or Northern California or wherever it is. Right. And for those of you out there too, since you're talking about this, on the 17th of January, there's going to be a polar vortex that is going to pull Arctic air all the way down to southern Mexico and the border of Guatemala, where it's going to be 20 to 25 degrees Celsius below normal temperatures. So think about that for a moment.
Yeah,
that's a huge dip south. Now imagine there should be an inverse dip and push north on the backside of that from the equator, warm air going north almost in the same kind of extreme. So I would say behind that, you're going to get like a superheat front that'll push all the way up in past British Columbia, and they'll get summer temperatures for a couple days, and everybody will, it's global warming.
Now it's very interesting.
No, it's our jet stream's broke and they're going into new places.
Now
hit it on the head right there.
A question is, what if you had a system, you wanted everybody panicked about climate change, and you had a way to artificially create what you just described? I think that is happening, because it's pretty well established in the sources that I've seen that geoengineering combined with the electromagnetic manipulation from the HARP systems, which are now all over the world, not just in Alaska, and that those two things together can steer not only hurricanes, but jet streams and pressure systems. And if that's true, and you could do that, which I think we're seeing, you would basically prove climate change, not if not global warming, at least disruption of normal climate, and that everybody has to give up their sovereignty and their rights and stop using all energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and could I throw a wild card on top of that?
Sure.
Ace of Spades. Since these changes in the sun are happening, now again, I keep talking about electromagnetism. The sun had a very high electrical state, so our Earth also picked up and matched that. The sun is stepping down in its intensity and its frequency and its electrical state. Our Earth is also doing the same exact thing to try to match that. So us, since it's an overcharged planet, if you will, I'm going to make it real simple. The batteries are equal, and then one battery drops down, the other one's a little bit overcharged, and then it's going to try to put the current and equalize with the two batteries. So one steps down, the other one has a higher charge. It's going to try to step down and match that. In our atmosphere right now, our atmosphere is so highly electrified because the charge from our Earth's crust is trying to make its way back to the ionosphere, back out into space and back and reconnect with the sun at the same charge equilibrium, but it's not. We're overcharged, overcharged capacitor, if you will. So the atmosphere it's more highly ionized. There's much more electrical conductivity in our atmosphere. And I think with these programs you're talking about, they're going to get even a more heavier, way more bang for their buck riding on top of this natural cycle, because use two different time periods. We're talking about 2020 right now with what you're talking about, geoengineering, hitting the waves in the sky and everything. Compare that with late 1990s. Our magnetosphere was really tight. There were very few cosmic rays coming in. Everything was completely equalized with our Earth and the sun, so there was no way. They would have to juice their systems probably 5, 10, 20x to get what they're getting right now with the 1x. Our atmosphere is the most highly charged it has been in probably 400 years. They have a window of opportunity to really push this envelope here with a higher, more highly ionized atmosphere at the moment. This is the reason you're getting the ground to sky lightning, and you're seeing all these electrical sprites, which are the top of thunderstorms, reaching back up to the ionosphere. Right. And over the hurricanes, you're seeing all these auroral blue jets. Those are all electrical currents visible that are so highly charged they're becoming visible to the eye. They're trying to reconnect back out to space. They're trying to reconnect to the field lines going back to the sun. They're trying to discharge the extra electricity off our planet. So think about that in the atmosphere and what you could do with the metals and the bending and all the frequency waves inside that electrified ionized soup. I'm telling you, they're getting a way higher amount of output for the same amount of minimal input than they could have in the 1990s.
As far as proving disruptive climate change, basically, it's easier to do now.
Or create it.
Create it and then prove it. Prove it by creating it is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, because obviously it's really beneficial to get the public to be totally panicked about warming, cooling, or just change in general if you don't know which is happening, because then they're willing to give up their rights to save the Earth, which is a big benefit of geoengineering. Plus, to further prove drastic climate change, you can start explosive fires by dropping metal dust on forests over decades, which is what's been happening, and it just got ignited over large parts of Australia, and they're immediately saying that proves climate change because there are a lot of fires. I'm sure that you've seen that happening, right, last few days.
Yeah, well, I would throw in there bad forest management as well, because the undercutting of the growth, they stopped doing that, exactly what you said.
Right.
15, 20 years ago. Same in California. Once they stopped cutting all the underbrush, you had those massive fires. Like that kindling would not have been there had we continued the practices from the 1980s. But you know what stopped that practice from happening? Global warming. You're cutting all the trees. We need all the trees. You can't cut the undergrowth.
Right. I think
it's a big looping circle. It's crazy.
They're combined factors because that makes fires easier to start and spread, but it doesn't make them melt metal and glass. For that, you need some extra help, right?
We sure do. And you know, some of that is Buck Rogers kind of tech, because you can't have something that melts porcelain and the trees next to it with the leaves that are not even scorched and still completely as green and supple as if they were in your own house and you just misted them with your bottle the same day.
Plastic bottles next to these unnatural house fires that were lying on the ground, like empty gallon milk jugs and stuff, those don't even get warm. And the house is like vaporized. And no one sees anything wrong with that picture.
I saw several of those pictures and I was unaware of that until somebody told me about it too. And you know, once I really looked at them, I'm still baffled on what that kind of energy weapon could be, or what kind of energy apparatus could do that. Something so close to the next thing. I'm still baffled as to what it is, because those images I saw are nearly impossible.
Right. It's not just a trigger mechanism. Like there are pictures. I don't have proof that they're real, but there's a lot of them with these visible laser beams going down right before a big fire started. But that does not explain how they can get it to burn up to an exact straight line and stop and no heat escapes. And most of the public thinks there's nothing unusual about that. And it's in cities where they just happen to be able to move in new zoning laws and everything, because obviously it's a dangerous fire area. So you can't be allowed to move back unless you're moving into a high density apartment. Then it's safe. So a lot of things are combined here as far as policies go.
Yeah, imagine if you wanted to rid a population out of a natural area, all you have to do is use that same, copy paste model, and you can't move back. Well, maybe it's, because again, they're working with the banks and the insurance industries. It has to be in tandem, because if I build a home up there and if I can't get it insured, well, I can't get a loan from an institution.
That's what's happening. The insurance becomes impossible.
Well, they won't say, no, it's in that kind of zone where it's, I don't care how much money you have or whatever, we just won't insure it, period. Like, it's not even possible. Right. Even if you're paying $10,000 a month, we will not insure it.
Not for a single family home, but for a high density apartment, it's somehow safe.
Yeah, it's totally safe. Like those things, you could, that'd be more like a heat box. Imagine getting trapped in one of these wildfires, like 15 floors up with nowhere to go. Like, imagine that heat swelling through the building and the elevators and breaking out the window. That'd be terrifying. You'd get scorched in there.
Yeah, it's hard to see how it's safe. Another point that I had wanted to ask you that you were going over is the length of these various cycles. And you were saying out of 100,000 years, there's about 10, or some people say 15, that is called the official interglacial period, right? And that according to that model, we're at the end of the current interglacial period. And that's aside from all the other things you're bringing up. So normally, if those glacial and interglacial cycles keep repeating, by that, if you weren't looking at anything else unusual, we should be about to go into the next ice age, it seems.
Yes. But again, that's, you come back to Hammaker's work there, you talked about, he was saying you got to remineralize the soil to kind of stave off some of these things.
Well, he said you could postpone the ice age if you do that globally.
That's correct. And it's such a simple thing, too. Everybody in the petrochemical industry is always banging on trying to use, an additional amount of fertilizers, trying to put adrenaline in the plants with a bunch of potash because they're not growing because the soils were too wet and too cool. But here was something so simple as just granite dust to spray the fields with. Can you imagine the enhancement in agriculture and the cut in a farmer's costs if they were just to use something so simple as granite dust? Again, it's an entire industry interfering with true workings of our planet in terms of how plants grow and reabsorb minerals and then protect themselves against pests by having a higher immune system themselves because they're so mineralized. And then the growth, look at the petrochemical industry involved just in agriculture. How many hundreds of billions of dollars a year just in that specific niche alone, all, could be undone by something that costs $20 a bag.
And river gravel works just fine. I mean, anything with a wide spectrum of minerals you just grind it up and spread it. And
that is way too simple and way too cost effective. How dare you? How dare you offer that as a solution to our planet?
We need to add that to Greta's lines as soon as possible. So, the other thing,
throw granite dust.
You do have to wear a dust mask, though. But I was going to ask you too about another cycle we haven't mentioned recently, which is, or anywhere in this conversation, I guess, the cycles of undersea volcanic activity that seem to be increasing right now, and volcanoes have hot material coming out of them. So that has an effect on warming oceans, at least locally. And they also have a lot of carbon monoxide coming out of them and other gases that are not especially suitable for breathing, So how does that fit into all the other cycles right now? And is it even true?
I just did a video a few days back on that off of the east coast of New Zealand. If you have Google Earth, please go to it and go to the east of New Zealand. You're going to find a full-on straight line volcanic ridge with 50 or 60 volcanic mounts there. And then if you go to Null School, which you can measure and check out sea surface temperatures globally, there has been an incredible hotspot over there. So with White Island going off and this incredible heat spot being shown out there east of New Zealand, guess where it is? directly over all that line of volcanic seamounts.
There's a lot of methane that comes out of that too, right?
Yeah, there certainly is. So you would also almost expect some ship sinkings out there, like random Bermuda Triangle kind of stuff. That's because a huge, gigantic, massive pocket of released gas would come up. That ship's in the wrong place at the wrong time, and when that gas breaks the surface, that ship loses its buoyancy and drops however many feet or hundreds of feet straight down because there's nothing buoying up the ship, and then the water snaps back shut, and then that ship's never seen from again, and it magically disappeared. Well, I would expect that over a volcanic ridge with massive eruptions going on. Cosmic rays cause, and this is peer-reviewed research again, I would try to give you a couple nuggets here for those of you listening. You're looking for a specific type of magma. It's not every magma that's affected by cosmic rays. Silica-rich magma is affected by cosmic rays. And it's interesting because cosmic rays are energetic particles, and light is knowledge, but then silica is able to hold knowledge. When you see how do radios work, they're using that little bit of crystal in there, and think about that, the light is igniting and causing vibrational changes in the silica in the crust of our planet. So wherever you're finding silica-rich, dense volcanic chains, these are the ones that are starting to erupt more frequently now, are having much more activity under the crust with increased earthquakes. This is all based on peer-reviewed research, silica-rich magma chambers and cosmic ray increases causing volcanic eruptions. Please use a PDF search engine for that. If you use a regular search engine, like, use your favorite one, but you won't get nearly the results because PDF search engines bang it down to all you're getting is PDF, that's it. None of the extraneous garbage of websites and all that stuff. It only gives you listings for PDFs. That's it. So,
what's a good search engine for that, for PDFs?
Like pdfsearchengine.org. I mean, go into your initial search engine and then type in PDF search engine and then click, and then there'll be about 15 or 20 of them.
Okay.
They almost all give the same results, but you can use a few different ones to see what your favorites will be.
So I never knew about that. That's great. Now,
way targeted information, incredible laser target on the info there, and you can pull up stuff you'll never, ever, never, 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 ever find on the regular web.
Amazing. The other thing is that if volcanic activity increased in areas where the ground was frozen, then that could certainly be melting ice from the bottom, right? If the ice was over the water.
And the Arctic Circle as well. Look up there, there's an enormous amount of volcanoes. Well, maybe not as many as the Pacific Ring of Fire, but there's a nice handful of volcanoes.
Right.
2 years ago, one of them erupted, and then it actually made a circular indentation in the ice cap, and then they blamed it on global warming, of course. But that was from a direct volcanic eruption in the Arctic up there. And again, if you're going to do any searching, look for, in a PDF search engine, you would put undersea volcanoes, Arctic Circle, and then they'll probably bring you up a bunch of maps, and they'll probably have, shown each one with coordinates, the height of it and everything, the last eruption because the ships cite this stuff a lot. They'll see smoke just coming out of the water, and then they'll put it in their logbook like, hey, smoke sighted out here. We got some ash on our sails when we're pretty much in the middle of the Pacific, so it was an underwater eruption somewhere.
Have you ever looked at the effect of methane as a gas in the atmosphere? There's a lot of the people who are talking about global warming are saying, well, CO2 is doing a lot of damage, but methane is way worse, and that it's coming out of these volcanic eruptions and the bottom of the ocean and places like that, and that it's going to have a massive effect. What do you think about that, aside from the fact that methane is, a poisonous gas for humans and animals?
Well, I'm saying there's not a lot you can do about it. It's a natural cycle and a natural phenomenon. You can't tax a volcano. I bet they're going to go down and start this next thing. Any country that has volcanoes, we're going to tax you for allowing the volcanoes to emit methane out of it. I could see that the next step.
It's very fair.
Country tax for volcanoes or something ridiculous.
Right. So
it's natural. So really, what can you do about it? And the melting of the permafrost has been going on from time immemorial. So you can't really tell me that the melting of the permafrost is a new thing that's been going on for the last, 10,000 years, and it happens every year. And then suddenly it's just a massive thing to think about because of some imaginary global warming thing that's causing the permafrost. If you go back even in this last 10,000 years of warmth, there's been 3 other times that were warmer than today. The medieval warming period, the Minoan warming period. But they don't like to talk about these pretty much because they show...
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so where is all the data coming from in what you've seen that show, for example, much more undersea volcanic activity now than for any time in the foreseeable past, and that everything's getting warmer worldwide, and there's record warm temperatures every year are getting worse? And where is that data coming from in your experience? Because it's pointed to by all the people who are talking about global warming, and there are many, and there are organizations and there are agencies, and they're pointing to this data that shows all this stuff. What's going on with that?
Well, the data is not exactly the same across data sets, and here lies one of the problems. So again, if you get into a debate with somebody and they start talking to you about global warming and they say, well, I read it on, I heard about all this, the warmest year. Just simply ask them, where's the raw data set for the satellite temperature measurements coming from? Usually you get a deer in the headlights after you say that. Well, herein lies part of the problem with cataloging the temperatures on the planet here. So you got 5 or 6 different data sets, all measuring temperatures, all giving different measurements. Now, the media loves to run with Climate Reanalyzer because they give the hottest readings, bar none, anywhere. Washington Post, New York Times, they love Climate Reanalyzer because it runs a full 1 degree C above what University of Alabama Huntsville or the UAH site run by Dr. Roy Spencer. They love that one.
Is that a website?
You can go to drroyspencer.com. He's the one who runs the University of Alabama Huntsville. He's the director down there.
No, but I mean Climate Reanalyzer. Is that a website?
Yeah, that's a website. Yes, it is.
.com?
I think it's .org. But just put Climate Reanalyzer in. It should pop up if you're using a search engine.
Okay.
And then do the comparative temperatures. And then you have remote sensing systems, RSS. And then you have GISS. That's another one run and maintained by NASA. So you get this whole strata out there, and they're all giving different temperature sets. So which one is the true one? Herein first, because if I'm using UAH and I'm using Climate Reanalyzer and I want to print a report that shows warming, I would very much choose the Climate Reanalyzer set and then base all my research off of Climate Reanalyzer. If I wanted to show just normal stable temperatures, UAH seems to have the most unbiased, just flat what it is temperatures. I would use that one if I was just, in general, just trying to show what the planet's temperatures are doing without any bias in it. I would use UAH.
So are there most realistically in what you've seen, are the temperatures more or less on the average stable right now, or are they getting colder? And if they're not getting colder, how do people predict that it's about to get a lot colder?
The heat spikes in the El Niños in 1998, 99, and then just the last 2015, 16.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at those two periods, especially the 98, 99, you'll see a nice drop off there after the El Nino heat spikes, because again, that was ocean heating that dissipates out. So you get this real fast let off of the ocean heat sink out there. So that has a really quick, within a year or so, effect on temperatures. And if you look at the linear trend over the last few years, we've been dropping in temperature since that point, and it hasn't seemed to rebound anywhere close to what it was in 2015 or 16. And if it was truly a heating hothouse planet, we should be equal with those temperatures, very closely equal with those temperatures, or eclipsed and been warmer than those temperatures. But it just hasn't. And then plus the solar forecast going out for solar cycle 25 and 26 show solar activity is going to decline. And based on past cycles, every 400 years, it seems that the weather patterns are disrupted enough that the food production on the planet gets disrupted enough to have a disruption in agriculture to the point that it disrupts the economy. And at that point, hungry people are angry people, and governments change, empires fall, fiefdoms collapse, and it's a cycle, time immemorial, on the money. And you can see that's the whole thing about it. I call it the fingerprints of the grand solar minimum, because these are the same things that happen every grand solar minimum. So with proven science showing, even NASA admits it, that we're heading back into deep cooling on a multi-century cycle, you would expect weather changes to now really affect food prices. So if food prices double or triple, your spending on other things is going to sort of really be pushed into this segment of food in the beginning.
Right.
And as more people become aware of this grand solar minimum, their spending habits are going to shift into preparation of tools, seeds, long-term food storage, water filtration, whatever it is. R-value increases on your homes. There's a million things that it could be. But things are going to shift in the economy. But there needs to be an excuse for it. I mean, we've been talking about this in what we're talking about here, the excuse for global warming to explain away the changes so when you saw them, you would understand it and not be afraid. They could also have a new tax associated with it. They could control society with it. But here we come. Now there needs to be another excuse why the food prices are rising. And then we suddenly have this eat-on thing going on, oil price increases, military-industrial complexes, stocks increasing all the way through the election. I think we're just being played the whole way through. I think everything's a play, a minuet or whatever. And then everybody's getting played at the moment to create excuses for things that are happening because they don't ever want to show it's a natural cycle. Because if the globe wakes up and understands it's a natural cycle, and they've been lied to this whole time, and their families have not been given time to prepare for these changes that we know have been coming for decades, I think the pitchforks are coming out myself.
So when you're predicting things getting cooler, is it primarily based on that 400-year cycle that you just mentioned?
It is. It's also based on the solar cycles decreasing. And what they'll find also, if you're looking at a regular 11-year solar cycle, you will generally get two spikes in the peak. It's not going to be just like one peak and then up. You're going to get A or B version of the peak. A smaller peak followed by a larger peak, or the inverse, a larger peak followed by a smaller peak. Now, when we head into these grand solar minimums, we get the smaller peak followed by the higher peak, and that's what we just saw in this last solar cycle. So that's the indicator that just as the polarity or the north-south orientation on a sunspot will change when the solar cycle changes, that's the same thing when we come into a larger iteration. We see one of the solar cycles themselves change on the cycle peaks, and that's another indicator of where we're going. That's all John Casey's work, and you can find more about that in his book, Dark Winter.
Okay, and so it's a 400-year cycle. It's like what happened around 1600 or so, but it's one of the larger, as you said, iterations of that cycle, right? But it's an example of the 400-year cycle. Is that accurate?
Correct. No, correct. And with this thing saying, like you say, stepping off into an ice age, I am of the volition that this is even a heavier, more powerful cycle than the 400-year cycle. That it's going to be a once in a 2,000-year cycle to a once in a 4,000-year cycle. Something like this would make sense if we're going to step down into that next big, 90,000-year cooling.
By steps, though, not just all at once.
We wouldn't. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
By steps, not just all at once, is what you're saying.
It could be all at once, too. A couple in the geologic record, they found, some of these ice ages onset as quickly as 10 years. Like from where we are sitting in today's climate to full-blown glaciation beginnings within 10 years.
Yeah. And what is the correlation? We've heard all about the polar bears drowning because there's no more ice to stand on in the North Arctic area. What's the real situation with Arctic ice, and how do you tell what version is true?
Since we're in this world of illusion at the moment, my best guess is Danish Meteorological Institute, the DMI.
Okay.
Now you can find their polar ice charts, and they do a really good job of getting ice. The Navy also, U.S. Navy, keeps an ice database. Cryosphere, I'm not sure. Maybe that's a manipulated one. But my best guess is Danish Meteorological Institute.
Okay. All right.
But again, it would be so easy to manipulate that data. Like, you're not even allowed to fly your own private airplane up there. You're not allowed to take your own private boat up there. It's forbidden, and you'll be shot down straight away trying to cross the North Pole. And I don't understand why. There's nothing strategic up there. And if you put a flight pattern in,
Admiral Byrd said some things about that.
Yeah, he sure did, didn't he? It makes me wonder why you're not allowed on the North Pole. If you're not a threat and you put a flight plan in or a sail plan in, or you told people where the boat's going, why can't you cross directly over that North Pole?
Exactly. If you promise to not look down and see the hole, which is supposedly covered by clouds and stuff anyway, according to Admiral Byrd.
Yeah. So, and then you need to make the periphery ring around that, which is a biozone. How dare you even take your, canoe or kayak up in there, because you can't disturb the biosphere of just an open ocean or whatever. Right. They have that whole ring around that too, where you're not allowed to disturb the biosphere in the Arctic.
You could run over a seal.
Gigantic place covered in ice every year. Even your footprints would disappear in the next ice cover. I can't believe how. Yeah.
There's something else. I mean, it's hard to believe the government would ever lie, but it sounds like there's something going on there. And that, of course, suggests the question of there's another pole to the planet, right? It's on the bottom. And that is even more restricted from what I've heard, that you can't go there without incredible kinds of authorization. So there's all kinds of theories about what's actually happening there as well. I mean, the flat earth people, of course, say it's the edge of the earth. That's why you can't look. But even the other people who don't believe that say that, Nazi bases or something like that are in the Antarctica, and it's all speculation if you haven't been there yourself.
Well, even if you get the authorization, you're very limited. Even if you get all that and you do all those hoops and paperwork, when you get there, you're only allowed to go to specific locations, and you're not allowed to venture outside of there at all.
Yeah.
Even if you have the most high-tech, ice, expedition, and you're the leader of ice expeditions, you're still not allowed to go down there with your own equipment and just go off and look. You're just not.
Yeah,
that's a continent covered by ice. You can do no damage there.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, Admiral Byrd, speaking of him, was on TV in the 50s, I think. Could be wrong about the time. And they were interviewing him, and he was saying, Antarctica has resources far more than the U.S. and other continents like that, and it looks like it'll supply energy and minerals for the whole world. And then it didn't happen for some reason. Something else is going on.
Well, I've seen a fair few reports, and again, if we're talking now, I'd like to go further out in the cycle duration here versus, 10,000 years, 12,000 years, 25,000 years. That's a little short for what I'm talking about. Because if we come back to the last interglacial, let's go back 115,000 years in time. They had 10,000 years of warmth just like we do now. It was actually 1.5 degrees or so warmer than today's temperature. So the ability to grow food would have been exponentially larger than we are, because their grow zones would have been really pushing toward 50 something degrees north latitude. They have the same cognitive abilities we do. They have the exact same anatomical structure. Their brains work the exact same way, and we're led to believe that they sat around there for 10,000 years and did nothing. Where's the tech from that time?
How long ago were you talking about?
About 115,000 years before.
Okay.
But then again, go back 2 of those ago, to say 230,000 years ago. Anatomically, we are exactly the same. The human, you could have taken a human from 230,000 years ago and dropped him on a street today, and there would be zero difference.
A little bit of coaching required to get used to it.
A little bit of coaching. Yeah. Otherwise, they look exactly the same. Their brains would be functioning the same. But what happened to those 10,000 years as well? Like, we are led to believe that we're the only ones that ever existed, that ever made anything ever. But what happened to those last 2 10,000-year periods of time with humans developing tech on a planet?
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting subject to go into itself. I think there's a lot of evidence that there were civilizations much more advanced than the current one in the past. But basically, what it all comes down to is that analyzing all this stuff, you're coming up with the conclusion that it's going to get colder. And so what, if I understand right, you're trying to do is help prepare people to get through that event more easily without all dying and having a bad time. And that may get into the question, why did you name your website what you did?
Well, the channel I named Adapt 2030 because we need to revamp and rethink and retool all of our agriculture before 2030 to get through all these changes. Now, over the next couple of years, we're going to see the years of extremes of this heat, cold, heat, cold. But as we come into 2023, 2024, it's really going to predominantly get cooler than warmer. We'll still have some of the extreme heat bumps from the equatorial vortex pulling further north. But in general, you'll see a decline in the Earth's temperatures. And I don't know how these powers that be will actually explain that away, except over geoengineering, we're the ones who did it. But when we get around 2028, this is the real time for the change in humanity, because there's several scientists, Valentina Zarkova being one, who says she's calling on governments now to start stockpiling for the lack of food that we're going to be able to grow from 2028 to 2032. So the Adapt 2030 channel is exactly that. We need to think about indoor vertical agriculture, retool and refit any system we can to, protect our crops more, because right now the soils are cold enough where we can't get crops in the ground this early in the game. I really don't know what it's going to be like in even 5 years from now. We're going to struggle with agriculture from this point forward. It's not about getting so cold. You can put a coat on, but the plants are going into hibernation mode because of the UV and the light changes in the sun. They're going into conservation mode. The soils remain cooler. The number of growing days globally has decreased over this last year as well, for the second year in a row. So there's all these slight signs showing that agriculture is going to struggle. And when it does, food's the most important thing for a society. So oilseed crops is all about what kind of plants, what kind of crops can be substituted in different areas on the planet. And how do we find out what's growing well right now in stress conditions and grow more of it there because it's growing there? And a perfect example is right now, the United States is at a 110-year low in hard red winter wheat planting. The reason is the hard red winter wheat's not growing so well anymore. The same number of acres are being planted, but they're replacing it with sorghum. Because sorghum can grow in these more stressed conditions where hard red winter wheat requires a very, very specific set of grow conditions, where sorghum's much more pliable, like silly putty. It can go through a lot of different conditions and still grow. So think about that. That's what I would consider in earnest the first switch of crops. They're never going to come out and tell you the reason for it, but I would say it's in play. If we're on a continental level already where we're switching crops because one's not growing because of soil conditions and temperature and rainfall pattern shift, that should be a big red flag saying, well, we got a huge problem, and we should be talking about it versus trying to make excuses for it and blame somebody else and tiptoe around it. We should be head on into this thing, tackling it right now, but we're not. So that's the reason I put up the site to compare information. I used to have a bunch of plantation studies on the side there with cranberry. That's another one that's really interesting to think about for cooler weather, to replace more northerly latitude type of crops for Canada and the United States, one called cranberry. It's a good one. But anyway.
Why don't you say what an oilseed crop is so people will understand what you're saying? And I assume that that's a type of crop you're saying should be used more.
Well, oilseed crops is just, we're familiar. I'll use the simplest example, soybeans. You can crush it and you can get the oil. You can get the soybean oil. Mm-hmm. You can use the cake, and the cake can be used for animal feed, chicken feed, fish feed, to feed animals. But then again, the soy can be used for us, for human consumption. So it has that whole range of product uses for many different things. But soya is just one of the oilseed crops that's out there. So think about it this way. If the crop grows and you can squeeze it and oil comes out for cooking, canola is another one, not so good for the body. There's a lot of health ideas about canola, but again, that's the kind of crop that grows. You squeeze the oil out of it. You can use the pressed cake for animal feed. You can use some of the stems too if you cut it right in harvest. They're trying to work with this to get that to blend with hay. So there's a whole bunch of different oil seed crops out there that we can use, and it's not specifically that kind of oil seed, that's it, but it's all about Moringa oleifera, the sticks that are coming out of there, the drumstick tree. If you squeeze those seeds, it's as high as quality as macadamia nut oil, but they call it the miracle tree because you can eat the leaves. Every part of the plant's edible. It's all medicinal as well with the roots and the barks and these types of things. It's not specifically just ground-based, like planted in rows from a machine. You know, you got to think Moringa oleifera, goji. There's like all kind of different things that we could use for things that could be in a plantation setting that could be much higher benefit with nutrient superfoods and could have much more bountiful output, and we just need to change our diet slightly. So I want to mention one last thing, the ancient grains, which not a lot of people talk about: spelt, buckwheat, amaranth, millet, sorghum. These are the kind of things that also should be considered that grow in stress conditions, but we're so focused on big ag farming. Corn, blast it with an enormous amount of petrochemicals. Wheat, slam it with a whole bunch of glyphosate, and keep that whole industrial wheel moving with these specific types of crops. But I personally feel, again, you can agree or disagree, that from this year forward, we're going to have to really start rethinking what kind of plants we grow, because they're not going to grow. We're going to have to switch crops for sure in the future. And that could be a niche for those of you out there in business going, it's not all doom and gloom. It's the greatest opportunity in human history. Look how much change we're talking about happening. People are going to need so much help during this time, and services and things are going to be changing on the fly so much. Look what value you can provide for people, and then find your niche in that for moving forward.
That might be a subject for a follow-up episode if you feel like it, because that sounds like a big subject. And the crops that you mentioned, like soy and canola and things, you have this little issue with the fact that, and corn even, that most of those crops grown in the U.S. now are not safe to eat. They're all GMO. And people think that non-GMO makes you safe, but no, like you said, you can use Roundup on so many crops. Just the farmers have been brainwashed and told that it's totally reasonable to use it for drying out crops to make the harvest easier, and it's totally safe to eat, and there's no residue, and everything's fine. So there have to be some changes other than changes in what crop you grow by quickly re-educating farmers why organic is like a minimal baseline of reasonable way to grow food, and then it has to get better from there. So we have some changes to do.
Thinking about that too, some of these more ancient grains, they're still heirloom, where they haven't been GMO modified yet, to my knowledge.
Right.
There's probably a couple hundred strains of amaranth, and it grows in cold conditions. And spelt, they haven't really modified that too much. Barley, maybe. But when you start to take a look at the ancient grains, there's about 15 of them, good list of 15. Mm-hmm. Some of them I have no idea how to grow. Others, I'm like, I've already grown some sorghum myself, so that's a pretty easy one. I can't seem to get the yields that these farmers are getting with the super giant heads. The ones I get about this big, and get three heads off of each one. But I don't know, again, on the home farmer versus a mechanized farm, your yields are going to be different too. Right. So when you say grow your own food, you're not going to be getting the yields that the farmers are generally. So
yeah,
help in a community setting for that, more hands to help.
Yeah, and there's some work that is not usually talked about in the biodynamic area, and what the double digging French intensive systems that Alan Chadwick did. On a small space, there are ways to get yields that are actually higher than on the big farms. But that's a whole learning curve too. So for the bottom line, since we're about out of time, for people to get the book and follow your work and your channels and everything, how do they stay in touch with what you're doing?
You can find the video production that I do on Adapt 2030. Again, we have to adapt our food growing strategies before the year 2030 for most of our societies to move through this and keep our lives intact, our societies functioning the way they do today, or similarly. You can find a lot of work that I do up there. I'm also up on Patreon, where I put individual things that I don't publish anywhere else, snippets of information, ideas, quick videos, thoughts, that kind of stuff's over there. And the oilseedcrops.org website, I have the podcast Mini Ice Age Conversations, and then I'll post that in a couple other different places too, either on YouTube or the website. Now the book, we decided to self-publish because in this climate debate, even Amazon is at the point of censoring authors and pushing down the listing and not giving it traction for organic search and everything. So we just decided right away we're not going to publish in any other platform except our own. So we self-published. and you have to go to PAYHIP, P-A-Y-H-I-P, to find that, and just type in Climate Revolution book inside any search engine, and it will take you to the PAYHIP page. I just don't like the idea that even now Amazon is getting involved to tell you what you can or cannot read about the whole issue of what's happening with our weather systems and our crop production and the economy, and you can only read what they want you to read. You're not allowed to find. So Mark Morano is a great example, and Dr. Roy Spencer, and any of these guys who are putting out books and writing their own books about this subject, they're up there for a day or two on the first initial listing, and then they drop down to like number 780, and it never appears anywhere unless you keyword search that exact thing, and then they'll bring up things that are similar to it. And this scares me too. You know, you're bringing up titles that have just one word of similarity to usurp that, and then even when you put the keyword search in, it'll still appear 17th down the line because they're replacing it with all these other books that have the same words in it. And there's this kind of censorship going on inside of Amazon.
Yeah,
so
that's their seal of approval. That means you're saying something that could be valuable. It's hard to monetize that kind of seal of approval, but at least you know that they're agreeing with you on a lot of what you're saying.
And I do get the Wikipedia entries under my videos quite a bit. So if you see the Wikipedia thing, it'll say, Wikipedia, click this to see the truth about global warming under my videos. When you see that, you know I hit something in there that they for sure did not want you to hear or listen to. I'll get demonetized on that. I'll click the menu review. It's hit or miss. Does it get monetized or not? I don't know. Again, it's hit or miss, especially when the Wikipedia articles are under there. So
yeah,
if you see one of those, make sure to watch it because that's a seal of approval too. There's something in there that should not be viewed.
Pretty interesting. Okay, well, a lot to think about, and hopefully we can do a sequel at some point about all the things that we didn't get time to go into. But thanks for the inspirational discussion, and hold on, we'll say goodbye in the break here. So you guys, there goes David DuByne. I hope that you found that discussion interesting, and remember his book Climate Revolution and oilseedcrops.org and adapt2030.com, I think it was, and he's got a YouTube channel like that, and he's probably on all the other major platforms and some minor ones, and Brighteon, it sounds like he's on there too, BitChute, all over the place like we're trying to be. I found that super interesting. I don't have a label that I'm defending about global warming or global cooling or anything. I'm just trying to be, see where my prejudices are and be as open as I can to actually learning whatever is going on, because there's a lot more happening than what we perceive for sure. Anyway, hopefully we'll stay in touch with David and do more with him in the future as things unfold the next few years, according to his or Joel's or anybody's predictions, look like they're going to be pretty intense. And remember that if you don't find us on these major platforms that you may be using right now, look for us on Brighteon.com. Our specific channel there is BRIGHTEON.com/channel/Lost Arts Radio, and our main site is lostartsradio.com, and you can get on our mailing list there so that we can stay in touch with you in case we get cut off. Otherwise, that'll be right on the page. You can see it easily. Just leave a name and an email address, and we'll be able to get information to you if it becomes the only way to do that. You can also email a message to info@lostartsradio.com with your name and email address, and we'll put you on the mailing list, or text a name and an email address to, if I can remember the number, 928-235-4676. Any comments or suggestions or questions or anything, you can email them to us, richard@lostartsradio.com. We also talked about our private platform where we get into more depth in some of this stuff for people that really want to start working on their own situation, their own physical body, life and health stuff that we can't talk about as openly on the public forum. That is planetaryhealingclub.com. You're personally invited to be part of it if you want to start actual life transformation work. That's where we look at that. planetaryhealingclub.com. And then our subscribe star page, if you have the resources and you want to help us stay on the air, because count carefully the number of commercials we did on the show, and you'll understand if we don't get money from somewhere, we're not going to be here. So there's a number of ways to help us if you would like to see us continue. Subscribestar.com/Lost Arts Radio. We also have a donate button on both of our sites, lostartsradio.com, and our nonprofit site, which keeps everything going and talks about the school and things like that. That's lostartsresearchinstitute.org. lostartsresearchinstitute.org. Any feedback, comments, feel free to share them. We have contact forms on the sites. You know about the Sunday show because that's what you're watching right now, but we also have a Saturday afternoon show, which is Lost Arts Radio Live, 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern every Saturday afternoon. Interesting subjects on that. And it's followed 30 minutes after by the private meeting for Planetary Healing Club. And you're invited to that if you want to. If you have questions about that, let us know. We'll tell you if you're trying to figure out whether it's worth your time or not to be part of that. I'll just tell you openly, yes or no, or what it seems like to me. And the access to that private forum is planetaryhealingclub.com. And I think that's most of what I wanted to remind you of. Just keep educating yourself. There's some interesting times ahead, no matter what. And self improvement and education is going to be critical regardless of what happens. So take care of yourself. It's the best way to start helping your family and the rest of the world. Take care of yourself really well and learn how to do that. And have a great week, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time. Talk to you soon.